The Apostle Paul found himself urging the Thessalonians to live lives worthy of the kingdom of God, and he even insisted on it. It was part of his teaching of the overall arching kingdom of God, God's rule and reign. And the kingdom of God has this present reality, but also future reality to come, the kingdom of the now and the not yet. And so as he appealed to them to live their lives worthy, he meant both of their calling here and now on earth, but also for their destiny yet to come. 1 Thessalonians 2:11 and 12, he says, "For you know how, like a father with his children," like he's appealing to his father, as a father, that we exhorted each one of you and encourage you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of the kingdom of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. He seems to be thinking that just as a father should be setting a consistent example of holiness, of uprightness, of integrity, good fruit, in other words, he wanted to encourage the people to live lives similar in a worthy manner of the kingdom and of glory. The kingdom and the church are two different things. The kingdom is not the church is not the kingdom. The church is part of the kingdom. The overarching kingdom of God is bigger. There's more at stake than just our petty little problems at times. This is why I like to, when there's strife in the church, I remind them of the kingdom of God, but there's gain a bigger perspective that there's the kingdom of God at stake, that there's people watching, both outsiders and insiders, so to speak. There's people outside the church, but people in the church that are watching also, family, friends, kids. They're watching how you talk, how you act, watching you, how you work, how you interact with people, your co-workers, etc. And if you don't think that people are watching you, you just make a mistake, and if you'll have fingers pointing, "Hey, I thought you were a Christian. Hey, didn't you say you were a Christian? I thought," because sometimes the world holds a higher standard than even Christians do. And it's also the way the enemy works. He'll tempt us to sin, and when we do, then he heaps it on us like saying, "Call yourself a Christian." That's just the way he works. He's the accuser. So, but what might be worse is when you are not alerted to your own sin, when you don't realize it and you're actually acting in a very unholy way, or you're treating people wrongly or whatever, and they don't say anything, but they just sort of tuck it away into their own knowledge, and they say, "You know what, if that's what it means to be a Christian, yeah, no thanks, I'm out." My dad worked on his own for quite some years as a landscaper, and he would often talk about that the worst people to work for were Christians, and I always wondered why that was. But he said they're always wanting the better deal, they're always wanting more. They're complaining about the price, even though he had already kind of cut the going rate down because he knew this kind of thing was going to happen. Or you've heard for years how waitresses say the worst day to work in a restaurant is Sunday, because that's when the church crowd comes in for lunch. And it's sad, but they say church crowd Christians are often rude or very overly demanding, and the only tip they give is this tip: "Hey, here's a tip, get to know Jesus." And I also know a lot of people who are working trying to change that mentality. They recognize that the waiter or the waitress is just simply a soul, a person who's trying to make ends meet, who's trying to get by life and do it with a smile, and they really do need Jesus, and so they watch us. You may have heard of Nicolae Ionescu, except you might know him by the name Richard Wurmbrand, who wrote many books, including Tortured for Christ, but he wrote something like 24 or 25 other books. And he was imprisoned as a pastor in communist Romania for many years. He was put into solitary confinement for 3 years. He had his feet beaten to a bloody pulp more than once. He said the pain of that was so unbearable. His body bore the scars of many years of torture. And after his paid for release, cost him $10,000, he finally was released, and he just worked tirelessly and endlessly, founded the organization called Voice of the Martyrs, which is still in full swing, going great. But there's a story about him in prison when, though he was tired and wounded himself, he would go to other prisoners in other cells and minister to them. There was one particular story of him ministering to a guy who had been beaten, and he was, putting a cold rag on his wounds, and he would give him his extra, actually, it wasn't extra, he'd just give him some of his bread and soup and stuff like that, and daily portions. And at one point, the prisoner would listen to him often talk about Jesus and about Jesus being the freedom, the true freedom. Even in prison, we can be free. And at one point, this guy says, if your Jesus is anything like you, then yes, I want to know him. If this Jesus is anything like you, I want to know him. Wow. That is living a life worthy of the kingdom of God, living a life worthy of the calling that we have. And we all have a calling to be his witnesses in our day and our time, that we would be witnesses for Jesus. That is our calling. Let's live a life worthy of that call.